Hello and welcome to this week's lecture. My name is Mags Chowcraft Islam. I am a playwright and I've also just completed a PhD at the UEA on slavery and abolition. I'm going to talk to you today about the history of Mary Prince, which I really hope you've read, even though we are approaching the end of the module. If you have, I'm sure you'll agree that it was worth the wait. There is so much to say about this text. It's hard to know where to begin. But I want to start by saying two things. The first is a kind of disclaimer, if you like. This lecture will analyse Prince's history from a literary and historical perspective. And as such, it might sometimes feel to you as if I've kind of lost touch with the emotional heart of the book. So it's important for me to stress that my intention is never to ignore or reduce the impact of Mary Prince's story. No one can read this book without being affected by the brutality and the horror of the narrative, and at the same time by the clarity and power of Prince's voice. And anyone who reads it will, I hope, feel implicated in some way, whether you are descended from the enslaved or from those who profited from slavery, which is all of us, by the way. This text will make you feel uncomfortable or angry or upset, and that's without even beginning to deal with the dialectics of guilt and shame. So this lecture does not aim to dismiss these emotional and personal reactions to the text or to diminish Mary Prince as a writer or as a person. I've been living with the history of Mary Prince for many years, and still sometimes the power and the pathos of the writing hits me all over again. So in this lecture, I will be dissecting and contextualizing Prince here in the hope of adding to our understanding of her work and her life. So please bear that in mind as I move through my lecture and onto my second point, which is that there is so much more going on here than it may appear at first reading. When you look at how much paratextual material there is, all the other writing that surrounds the narrative, you begin to realize how important the context of this work is, the social and political context, and how important it still is today. This book was hugely controversial when it first came out. The first testimony by an enslaved woman from the British colonies. The first book by a black female British subject to be published in this country. It's a book written by a black enslaved woman. Talk about intersectionality. This is someone with the lowest possible status, someone who was in fact considered a non-person. And it is filled with horrific accusations against white people, respectable white men and women. Prince's book was dynamite in 1831, and it still is now. That's because it has been subject over many years to multiple interpretations. For some people, Prince has become a symbol of black resistance who takes a top place in the black literary canon. For others, the search for an authentic voice in this book is fraught with difficulty. Why? Because of the way it was produced, because of who produced it and what it was produced for. As I'm sure you know, no text exists independently of its production, especially a text by such a delegitimized, disenfranchised human being. The abolitionists worked with Prince to publish this text as a propaganda pamphlet for their cause. It was dictated to a young female abolitionist, Susanna Strickland, and edited by Thomas Pringle. So what happened to Prince's words in this literary machine of mediation and filtration? We will never know. All we can do is to study the words we have closely and look for clues in the text. So we can find the silences, the omissions, the hesitations, the inconsistencies. And of course, we can also look at the context. So to that end, I'd like to start by thinking about slavery itself. I used to begin this lecture by moaning about the fact that nobody wants to talk about slavery in this country. In the last year, of course, this has begun to change. It's sparked by the murder of George Floyd the global gains made by the BLM movement, the spread of awareness about structural inequalities and post-colonial legacies might mean that empire and slavery will finally be discussed openly in the public space and educational spaces of this country. Britain is good at collective forgetting. We have been very thorough and successful in erasing slavery from British national consciousness. Two things have made this possible. The first is geography. The Caribbean is very far away. And the second is our collective fixation with the one redemptive chapter in the whole story, William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. As the historian David Olusoga says, this fixation with the ending of slavery has behaved like a fig leaf behind which the larger, longer and darker history of slavery has been concealed. Now, I'm going to run through a few figures. Apologies if you know these basic facts already. I'm sure many of you do, but they are worth reiterating. In all, about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World. Of those people, approximately 10.7 million survived the journey, disembarking in North America, the Caribbean, and South America. Well over 90% of enslaved Africans were imported into the Caribbean and South America. Only a small percentage were sent directly to British North America. The British alone shipped around 2.1 million people between 1662 and 1807. North American plantations were dwarfed by those in the West Indies, present-day Caribbean. The slave trade ended in 1807. North America abolished the slave trade in 1808. So contrary to the popular myth, this was not just due to the philanthropic nature of the British people, but there were a number of factors. It's obviously a huge subject, and it's terrible to try and reduce it down to a couple of sentences, but there was obviously the abolitionist movement, which played its part, and so did slave rebellions all over the Caribbean, all over the colonies. The most significant of which was, of course, Haiti, which was the most profitable sugar colony in the world. The story of this astonishing revolution is rarely celebrated. There is also the question of the decline of financial profitability, which is a thesis which was offered by Eric Williams in his foundational work, Capitalism and Slavery. Slavery itself did not end until emancipation in 1834. And it was only made possible because British slave owners were offered financial compensation. It was followed by enforced apprenticeship, which was exactly the same as slavery, which lasted until 1838. Emancipation came in North America in 1863, so that's only 25 years difference. A few more facts and figures. So £20 million of taxpayers' money was paid to compensate Britain's 46,000 slaveholders. The enslaved received nothing. This is the modern equivalent of about £17 billion, and it was the biggest bailout using public money until the bailout of the banks in 2009. It represented 40% of the national budget, and it wasn't paid off until 2015. There were lots of beneficiaries. Just as an example, the Prime Minister William Gladstone's father was paid £100,000, which is the modern equivalent of £80 million. So many fortunes were made. There were personal and commercial and institutional beneficiaries. There are a few famous names like the families of George Orwell, Graham Greene, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, David Cameron, just a few of them. But you didn't have to be upper class. There were investors who sometimes had just one slave. My own family were slaveholders in the Caribbean. So obviously I have a strong sense of my position in this material, but nobody is exempt. Whatever the color of your skin, this subject concerns you. Also, about 40% of the owners, the slaveholders in the colonies, were women, which is interesting because Women tended to outlive their husbands, and they simply inherited human property through their partner's wills, which adds an interesting element to this discussion. So much for the figures. What about the people, the enslaved themselves? I'm not going to show you any images here of people in chains, being tortured, being subjected and victimized that you might normally associate with slavery. These images appeal to your empathy, but they also blur the boundaries between witness and voyeur. I, among many others, are very uneasy about this double brutalization of the black body used as spectacle. On this topic, I want you to think for a moment about the iconography of slavery and the way images are used. The image I will show you is the emblem of the anti-slavery movement, and it's still often reproduced. It's on the front of the Penguin edition of the copy of Mary Prince that you've been reading. It started out as a man who was kneeling and asking this question: am I a man? Am I not a man and a brother? And then it was also transferred to the woman who asks, am I not a woman and a sister? So if you notice, I want you to notice how this image is working. The black man or woman must be kneeling, must be in a low position, a lowly position, from which he or she must beg or supplicate for freedom, something which was stolen from them in the first place. They must be half naked to show their raw, uncivilized state, and they must ask a question. They're not making a statement, I am your brother, I am your sister. They have to ask this question. So if you contrast this with images that we might now associate with black power, it shows you how different the nature of the debate was in the 18th and 19th centuries. The abolitionist movement, who used these images, they deployed tactics to target the British people specifically. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But now let's turn to Mary Prince herself. We don't obviously have an image of Mary, unfortunately, but this photograph is sometimes used to represent her and other enslaved domestic workers. You can see here how Mary fits into the hierarchy. And you can start to imagine what it would mean for a person of such low status to have written a book, not just any book, but one which accuses the representatives of one of the most powerful nations in the world of barbarism. Only by considering these factors can you start to understand what's at stake here and why Prince needed collaborators in order to publish her story. As I mentioned earlier, the book consists of a relatively short story hemmed in by paratext, that is, editorials, supplements, another slave narrative, and in later editions there are also court cases, letters, anti-slavery poems, etc. It's typical of the slave or freedom narrative genre that it had to be surrounded by these affidavits and evidence of good and honest character, usually by white men. As the African-American scholar Henry Louis Gates tells us, authors of African descent who began publishing imaginative literature in English in the late 18th century had to confront a collective and racist text of themselves, which Europeans had invented. Black people were not included in the Enlightenment definition of what it meant to be an individual. As I'm sure you discussed in your seminars last week, the genre of modern autobiography, which was emerging at this time, was generally a white Western white male preserve. It was based on the view that each individual possesses a unified, unique selfhood that is also the expression of universal human nature. It was a literary canon that privileged a specific Enlightenment archetype of sovereign selfhood. However, this concept of the unique self did not include subaltern peoples, who largely fell outside the Enlightenment definition of the universal. The African writing subject threatened the whole hierarchy. How could slavery be justified in a world where it was possible for a slave to write a book? That's why slave and freedom narratives were so heavily policed, and that's why it was so important to qualify them as exceptions. Books like this were dangerous. The abolitionists knew this, which is why Mary Prince was very useful to them for propaganda. Their mission, as we know, was the ending of slavery. But it would be a mistake to think of this mission in terms of equality. People like Wilberforce were anxious to ban slavery on moral and religious grounds. The institution of slavery demeaned the slave owner as much or more than it did the enslaved person. This doesn't discount the idea that some of them still thought of black and mixed race people as inferior. Wilberforce himself chaired a dinner in 1816 of the Asian and African Society, where he separated the black guests from the whites by a screen. I can imagine a nice little scene in one of those lovely feature films where, about white saviors. Needless to say, it doesn't feature. So who were the abolitionists? So it's 1830 by now. So the slave trade has been abolished for over 20 years, but slavery itself is still going strong, as is the Anti-Slavery Society under its original founder, Thomas Clarkson. He was the man who did all the work while Mr. Wilberforce fraternized with the great and the good. You can see in this picture that there are some people of color and some women in this painting, even though women weren't actually allowed in to most of the meetings. But when this was painted, some of them objected, so they were put in. And you might know this as the Anti-Slavery Society, but actually its name was very telling. Its name was the Society for the Mitigation and Gradual Abolition of Slavery throughout the British Dominions. The clue is in the name. They were a bit slow. This prevaricating stance was not good enough for some people. There was an abolition society led and run by black citizens under Oludo Equiano, but unfortunately history has done its best to obscure the details of it. There were also some women's voices too, notably the redoubtable Elizabeth Hayrick, who declared that these male abolitionists had shown a great deal too much politeness with their slow, cautious, accommodating measures, and that their aim of gradual abolition was in fact the very masterpiece of satanic policy. She called for immediate, not gradual abolition. It was pressure such as this from the women's groups that eventually forced the men to adopt that policy. At this time, the idea of women intervening in the public sphere was very distasteful. Wilberforce himself said that for ladies to meet, to publish, to go from house to house stirring up petitions were proceedings unsuited to the female character. But white British middle-class women played a key part in introducing slavery into the public consciousness and keeping it there. How did women qualify their association with such activities? Well, they used their gender. They claimed that they had special suitability to intervene in matters of the heart. Just as you may have seen with Margaret Cavendish in The Blazing World, this idea about making a virtue of necessity. Many women confined themselves to prescribed female social roles, such as the one celebrated here. By ladies, this subject, as in the subject of slavery and abolition, has been contemplated through the pure medium of virtuous pity, unmixed with those political, commercial, and selfish considerations which operated in steeling the hearts of some men against the pleadings of humanity. So you can see the terms of the debate here and the prescription of how women should apprehend this subject. So that's what they did. They consistently focused on the workings of affect and the sentimental representation of bodily suffering to make their case. They relied on provoking an empathic response from a sympathetic witness, i.e., the reader. Key to this belief, the power of sympathy to raise awareness of suffering, is the idea that you can change the audience's view of that suffering and direct their opposition to it. It seems obvious now, but humanitarianism was quite a new idea at that time. Unfortunately, this projection by women onto the enslaved, of their own powerlessness, led to depictions of unproblematized, homogenized, voiceless victims, and the propagation of stereotypes. Hannah More's Slavery, a Poem, 1788, constructed just such a model, and it was used and copied for countless other portrayals of enslaved people. So if you look at the language here, bring each benighted soul, great God, to thee, and with thy wide salvation make them free. The vast bulk of anti-slavery literature at this time created this set of familiar, preconceived references. And these, plus a few individual vignettes, risked becoming stand-ins for the real life institution of slavery. Onto this scene comes Mary Prince, a real woman. Mary didn't present as a victim, despite having suffered horrific abuse. She had consistently defied every one of her owners from the first time she rebelled as a teenager to the moment she took her own freedom in London. She was a valuable asset in the household, and she exploited that. She was left in charge, she bargained, she sold goods. But we tend to think of plantation society as a brutal, terroristic system of agricultural labour, which of course it was. But there were enslaved people in every strata of life. And different power dynamics were constantly being played out in different ways. Some enslaved people were able to manipulate their positions to some extent. Like many enslaved people, Prince resisted in different ways. As Moira Ferguson emphasizes, far from being the silenced, gazed upon other, denied experience and individuality in both pro and anti-slavery texts, Prince defiantly constitutes herself through her utterance, identifying herself to the world as a thinking, feeling woman. So Mary is brought to London in 1830 by Mr. and Mrs. Wood, having persuaded them to let her accompany them. Apparently she hoped the weather might cure her rheumatism. Well, that's what she said. Not much chance of that, and of course it gets worse. She eventually leaves and enlists the help of the Anti-Slavery Society. She gets a job as a domestic servant in Thomas Pringle's house in London, where she tells her story to Susanna Strickland, and the resulting book is edited by Pringle. Strickland, a lodger in Pringle's house, is a young literary woman from Suffolk. She writes in her diary that she has been writing Mr. Pringle's Black Mary's life from her dictation, adhering to her own simple language without deviating to the paths of flourish and romance. Mr. Pringle has added an appendix, and I hope the work will do much good. Of course, my name does not appear. So not only is Mary perceived as inherently unreliable, but Susanna, the amanuensis, has also been erased. This draws an interesting parallel between the status of women and that of the enslaved, one which was often made. The chains of marriage were compared to the chains of slavery. Again, the links between women and the enslaved are emphasized. But of course, any comparisons we make should really be treated, or have made in the past or make now, should be treated with extreme caution, given the overwhelming differences between white women's subjectivity and that of enslaved people. But back to that house in Pentonville. What really happened there? The history portrays Mary as a good Christian woman who mobilizes the discourses of religion and sensibility to rally people to her cause. But if you look closely at the text, there are some interesting clues that throw light on her character. Firstly, we should pause to appreciate Prince's idiomatic command of the language, what Pringle calls her peculiar phraseology. There are some lovely metaphors, such as this one. The English people come home from the West Indies and say that slaves don't want to get out of slavery, but they put a cloak about the truth. Or this one, when she arrives at the home of her new owners, the Inghams, after she's been sold at the auction. She says, the stones and the timbers were the best thing in it. They were not so hard as the hearts of the owners. These are not just compelling metaphors, they are challenges to a socio-economic system that is at the heart of British life. This idea that slaves don't want to get out of slavery is as old as the hills. How often have we heard, and do we still hear that argument deployed about issues of liberation? The pro-slavery lobby were constantly producing evidence that well-fed and well-cared-for slaves were happy. Prince dismisses this idea just as she sweeps away the notion that the owners of enslaved people were benevolent, another idea that was very prevalent. This pretense, by the way, still continues to this day. A recent Bermudan Tourist Board brochure tried to claim that slavery on Bermuda was less harsh than elsewhere in the Caribbean. It was withdrawn, actually, after complaints. But Prince states unequivocally, I tell it to let English people know the truth. All slaves want to be free. Here she signals that ownership of the truth does not rest with the white man. She seizes authority and she speaks on behalf of her community. Is this incarnation of Mary Prince compatible with the humble, pious woman depicted in other parts of the story? This is the kind of question where we had to wonder, did the abolitionists downplay some aspects of the story and emphasize others? In the sections on religion, we can detect the guiding hand of the abolitionists. Nor must I forget, she says, the Reverend Mr. Mortimer. This suggests that she's forgotten him. She also says, I trust in God, I have profited by what I have heard from him. She doesn't really seem convinced. She doesn't say, I have profited. She has to trust. She has to take it on trust, to trust in God. Mr. Mortimer tells me that I must pray to God to change my heart and make me know the truth, and the truth will make me free. Can we detect the echoes of an argument in this passage with words like must, make me? Some element of coercion perhaps could be at play here. And when she says, I enjoy the great privilege of being enabled to attend church 3 times on Sunday. It kind of almost sounds ironic. Now, consider this passage. This is part of the memorable retelling of the auction, that passage in the book, when she was just 12 years old. She says, did one of the many bystanders think of the pain that wrung the hearts of the Negro woman and her young ones? No, they were not all bad, I dare say, but slavery hardens white people's hearts. Oh, those white people have small hearts who can only feel for themselves. I borrowed a couple of stills from my play about Mary Prince. This is Mary and Susanna here. This passage here seems to highlight the contest between the author and editor, or amanuensis, or both, over what Prince was supposed to represent. Firstly, the anger threatens to break through the smooth, sentimental mode of telling, favoured by Pringle, troubling his careful marketing of Prince as the archetypal helpless female victim. And then, as if to emphasize this, there's an interjection. They were not all bad, I dare say. It's almost as though her indignation has been checked by an external intervention in mid-flow, prompting her to concede that not all white people behaved in that way. This evidence of intervention has led many critics to conclude that the narrating voice does not actually represent Prince at all, and that the agency ascribed to her in this narrative may be more representative of the agendas of the external creators of the text than of Prince herself. So as a playwright, I'm interested in Mary's language, in all these allusions and these suggestions and small ways of winning authority. We can look elsewhere in the text for clues, or in the paratext, in fact. Thomas Pringle lets slip at some point in the editorial that Mary feels deep, though unobtrusive, gratitude for real kindness showed to her. I just love that, unobtrusive. She also has a somewhat violent and hasty temper, and a considerable share of natural pride and self-importance. These are traits that were absolutely not desirable in a female. But of course, they're the same traits that enabled Prince to break away, to get through, to survive, because she had a good dose of what we now might see as a really positive attribute, self-esteem. We also have to pay attention to the silences in the text. Its use as propaganda for the anti-slavery movement meant that Prince must appear morally unimpeachable. This censure meant not only erasing any sexual abuse, and we know from other sources that virtually all enslaved women were sexually abused, but also any trace of her own sexual agency. References to her sexuality are very limited, and the complete silence on the subject of children could point to abolitionist moral concerns over illegitimacy or miscegenation. She is known to have had relations with both freed black men and white men, which was another way to gain power in a colonial society. There are passages such as this one, which is about Darrell, another of her masters. He had an ugly fashion of stripping himself quite naked and ordering me to wash him in a tub of water. This was worse to me than all the licks, the beatings. Sometimes when he called me to wash him, I would not come. My eyes were so full of shame. So this has been widely pointed out that this is encoded. It's an encoded passage for sexual abuse. And of course, we also have the transcripts from the courts. After the book was published, Thomas Pringle was sued for libel, and Prince was called to give evidence in court. So from the transcripts in the courtroom, we have quite a different story from Mary than the one which appears in the history. Witness, which is Prince, said she had lived 7 years with Captain Abbott. One night she found another woman in bed with the captain. This woman had pretended to be a friend of the witness. Laughter. She beat her, and the woman was obliged to get out of bed. Laughter. She told all this to Miss Strickland when that lady took down her narrative. So there we have it. These are things which are missing from the narrative, which it plainly says were told to the amanuensis at the time. So to conclude, you can see how we can build up a picture of how Prince's history was shaped by the abolitionists. Pringle claims in the editorial, no fact of importance has been omitted, and not a single circumstance or sentiment has been added. This clearly depends on your definition of importance. What is important changes over time. To us, some of the most important elements of this narrative are the parts that were left out. It's only by looking at the circumstances surrounding Mary Prince, the paratext, the court cases, the letters to newspapers, the petitions to Parliament, the societal constraints on women and the activities of the abolitionists, that we can start to develop our understanding of how an autobiography, a memoir essentially, can become a piece of propaganda. The abolitionists knew the power of a personal story. Even today, humanitarian organizations still use personal testimony in this way. And of course, without their social networks and political reach, we might never have had the chance to read Mary Prince's story. The arguments over authenticity, voice, and representation in the narrative are set to continue. Although it's clearly fraught with ambivalence, I believe, and along with some other critics, that there are moments when the ring of personal experience and the unique voice is unmistakably present. Prince has been called unique for so many reasons. However, it must be remembered that there were millions of people who lived and endured as Prince did, whose voices remain unheard. So thank you for listening. I hope very much that some of you will write your essays on Mary Prince. I've put my details on the next slide. Here, email address, also a shameless plug for my play about Mary Prince, which is called Mother Country. It's COVID permitting, it should come to the Edinburgh Festival in August 2021. The last slide is actually a trailer for the show. So if you want to miss out that, please do feel welcome to do that. You just click on it and it will play. Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
My master keep me once for true and gave me clothes and kisses.
Everybody thinks of the enslaved people as powerless and ugly.
Fine muslin coats and bitty too, to gain my sweet embraces.
And Mary Prince is so powerful.
You wish me to find words for it. For you, everything can be done with a few words.
So we think about slavery as something which happened in America. In this country, we don't relate it to ourselves now, and I think it's really important that we should re-examine it.
Amanuensis. It sounds like a kind of flower, the colour of milk.
Mother Country is a play that reimagines the moment that Mary Prince, a Caribbean enslaved woman, sat with Susanna Strickland in a room and told her story. When I read it, I really wanted to direct it because it has a message for the world today.
If you have a complaint, Miss Susie...
Oh, no, nothing like that. Please don't perch.
I have work to do. Is that a carriage stopping?
Oh, sit down! Please.
This whole process has been phenomenal. This is a real great, chunky project, and it's nice to bring this to the awareness because so many people don't know about these particular stories. So many people haven't really heard of Mary Prince.
I'd never heard of Mary Prince before the engagement in the project. It's forced me to look into lots of stuff, face a few truths. And what happened to the pig?
Oh, why you care so much about the pig for?
One of the reasons it's called Mother Country is because the writer is questioning the relationship between the people of African descent who were in the colonies and who are now in England? Do they belong here? Do they have a right to be here? And the play says, yes, we are a part of you.
I have tried all my life to love Scotsmen, but I'm obliged to desist from the experiment in despair.
It was something that was very challenging to watch and something that actually had a lot of echoes down to our current society. There were lots of things that were raised there that are still preconceptions that people have.
My tear is coming down. It's so brilliant. Well done.
Don't talk to me about shame. Shame, my best friend. He climbed into bed with me every night.
We want to take this around the Caribbean. We want to take it around England and to London.
It's a really, really important message that people need to hear, and it gets more and more powerful throughout the play.
Me is just whatever they make me. This is the way they bring me in, so God, not devil.